Tonight we're in Liverpool, and welcome to Question Time. And with me tonight, the Government Minister for Transport, head of David Cameron's policy unit in the run-up to the last election, Jo Johnson. Labour's Shadow Secretary for International Trade and former Northern Ireland Minister, Barry Gardiner. The Guardian journalist, novelist, Radio 4 presenter, Jonathan Freedland. The news editor of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Kate Andrews. And the investment fund manager and entrepreneur, Nicola Horlick. And as always, of course, at home you can argue with the issues that are raised here. The hashtag BBCQT. Our first question tonight, Mohammed Ahmad, can we have yours, please?
If Britain take action against Syria, military action, what will be our end game and what do we hope to achieve?
Jo Johnson.
Well, the Cabinet met this afternoon to consider this question, and what's been decided is that we must act as a country to uphold the norm against the terrible use of chemical weapons that we've seen in Syria recently. And it's also decided that we must help alleviate the humanitarian distress in that country, which has been appalling over the last 7 years of this terrible conflict, with millions displaced internally and millions more displaced out of the borders of Syria. So our objectives in taking any action, and I have to stress that no decision has been taken as to the nature of any action that we might take, would be to make sure we're upholding that critical convention established since 1925 that countries should not, with impunity, use these terrible chemical weapons.
And when you're talking about action, are you talking about action agreed with the United States and France?
Yeah, what's been agreed in Cabinet today is that the government, led by the Prime Minister, should continue to work closely with this is technology interfering, should continue to work closely with France and the United States to ensure that the three major Western military powers hold the line, hold this important international line against the terrible use of these chemical weapons.
And would there be a parliamentary vote on this before the government took any action or the Prime Minister agreed to any action being taken?
Well, we're clearly not at that stage yet, because we haven't decided as a government the nature of any response which we will take. It's just worth noting, though, that there isn't any constitutional requirement for there to be a parliamentary vote.
I.e. wouldn't necessarily go to Parliament?
Not necessarily. If Parliament's job is to hold the executive, that's the government, to account for its actions, and the government is not to decide these matters for the government, it's to hold the government to account, and that's the crucial thing. The Cabinet Manual, which is the sort of the Bible of constitutional propriety in our system, makes very clear that governments can act when situations are urgent and there's a need for it to do so in a prompt and rapid
Well,
manner.
you're the only government minister on this panel, so reading between the lines, what you're saying is Parliament is not going to be recalled. The Prime Minister and Cabinet will decide what to do.
No, I'm not getting ahead of myself or ahead of decisions that haven't been taken. What I'm saying is, in the abstract, there's no constitutional requirement either for a parliamentary recall or for a parliamentary vote.
OK. Jonathan Freedland.
Well, the first thing I think you would want to say is that if the government, and it should, cares about the innocent victims, the civilians in Syria, a first move it could do right away is to look at those Syrian children who are desperate to come as refugees and take more of them here. And there was a scheme to allow some here, and it was closed down before even 300 or 350 had come. But there is a big dilemma here, and anyone who says to you it's an easy decision is wrong, because on the one hand, one option is to kind of give a blank check to Donald Trump and to fall in behind him. And we can all imagine the risks entailed with that. He's too reckless to entrust a military operation of this seriousness. And there's such a bad record of intervention in the Middle East particularly. Western intervention has so often made things worse, and we know that. And there's also this extra dimension now, which is you could end up in a direct confrontation with Russia. So those are all the reasons why nobody would want to give a blank cheque to Donald Trump on this. On the other hand, the other option facing us is that we give a free pass to Assad in Syria, and we say it's okay to use these absolutely heinous weapons, these chemical weapons, and to also to have killed, as he has, more or less 500,000 people in Syria in the last 7 years. And to give a free pass to him with a record like that says that we're setting up a precedent, that people can act this way with impunity, and who would want to live in a world like that?
So what do you conclude?
So therefore you come to the view that you have to do, I think, something. And those people who say diplomatic efforts, we should increase those, well, we've been trying that for 7 years, and the Russians particularly have vetoed it at every turn and frustrated it. So what I've come to is that there are some voices, including the Syrian opposition voices, who are saying, yes, military action, but not of the kind that probably Donald Trump has got in mind if you look at his tweets, but instead a very precise approach which says each time he kills civilians, then the response is to deprive him of a specific strategic asset, whether it's an airfield or a command centre, that enables him to kill civilians. Rob him of that arsenal,
all right,
point by point, not some blanket, indiscriminate attack, but a precision approach. And I worry that Donald Trump, if he's at the helm of this command, won't be the person we can trust to do that.
You, sir.
If I was in Syria and I was being gassed by my government, I'd want the world to come to my help. And I think that we're even considering not doing something is a disgrace. We have to go in there. We have to go and sort this out.
OK. And the person is... Yes.
The UN has called the biggest humanitarian catastrophe right now is in Yemen. And if our government is so concerned with humanitarian catastrophe, why are we continuing to sell weapons to Saudi?
It's a good point, but let me...
devastating impact in Yemen.
Let me call you back to the question, though, which Mohammed Ahmed asked. Kate Andrews.
I want to thank you so much for asking that question, because you've hit a nail on the head that US and UK foreign policy hasn't been able to do for years when it comes to Syria. What is the end game? What is the point of dropping these bombs if we have no action plan to help the region afterwards? If there's no real plan to remove Assad and his regime, then it's meaningless. It truly is meaningless. Us bombing his people isn't going to bother him. He's happy to do it himself.
So what do you say to Jonathan Friedland's point? You disagree with Jonathan on this?
Well, I'm not quite sure what tactic you wanted to take, but I think if the US and the UK and France want to come together for a solid strategic purpose, let's consider it. But frankly, this war should have been fought 5 years ago. And to respond to children being gassed by bombing those same children is not the right way to go. My solution would be to target them.
The proposal isn't to bomb the children. The proposal, and nor is it to say regime change on Assad. What I said there was you hit very specifically the targets, the equipment, the arsenal he is using to kill those children.
If you can, but the UK's public policy so far has actually been to drop bombs in the area to target Islamic State. We cannot pretend that that has not hurt civilians in the process.
All right.
So unless there's a proper process...
OK. You sir in the second row from the back there.
I think in this country we pride ourselves on our law and legal system, which presumes innocent until proven guilty. Before investigators had even got on the ground in Syria, you were already saying it was Assad. We were lied to about the weapons of mass destruction, about Saddam Hussein, and we're not going to fall for it again. The people of this country are too wise to this now. Over 1.3 million people died as a result of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. We need to think carefully about this before we take action.
OK. Barry Gardner.
The question that was put was absolutely right, because it focused on what is our objective, who or what are we targeting, what do we actually hope to achieve through any action that we take, and what follow-up measures do we propose in the aftermath. Unless we can answer those questions, then we end up in a situation like we have done before, where things then go badly wrong. And the place to answer those questions is in the House of Commons. It is absolutely imperative that those questions are put and answered by the Prime Minister before any military engagement takes place. I absolutely accept that it's right that if this country were ever in imminent danger of an attack, then of course it would be for the executive to take immediate action to protect our citizens. That is absolutely right. And nobody's trying to take away that power from the government or from the Prime Minister. But in a situation where there isn't that urgency, where we're not under threat, it's absolutely essential that we now abide by what has become, only recently, but has become the convention that Parliament is the place to authorise military action.
Okay. Do you... Picking up on the point made by the man in the second row from the back there, do you believe Assad was responsible for this, what has now been established as a chemical weapon by the inspectors being used?
Look, he made a point in this situation because the inspectorate from the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons need access on the ground. That, of course, is incredibly difficult to secure. But we do know Assad has used these chemical weapons before because the inspectors have verified that before and the UN has called him out as guilty. So there is a track record here and that was at Khan Sheikhoun last year. But of course what happened then is the Americans went in, they bombed, it achieved nothing.
And so
it hasn't actually stopped.
Yeah.
It hasn't stopped this use of chemical weapons. So that's why the questioner is absolutely right to say that we have to have a laser-like focus on what our objectives are, what we believe we can achieve through this, and how we then deal with
understand that. You're setting out the stall. What's your answer?
I take Jonathan's point. And I think it's something that we should look at, that should be discussed, about how you take punitive action against a regime, but do that in such a way that you do not escalate the situation. And that you don't, and this is a point that Kate made very forcefully and very well, that you don't actually further endanger the lives of innocent civilians. And that's why this is a difficult situation, and that's why we shouldn't just be saying gung-ho, we've got to do something, so let's go in there and drop a few bombs. Ultimately, what we all know is that this is going to be resolved by a ceasefire, by a de-escalation, by a negotiated settlement under the United Nations.
Oh, really? Where do you get all this from?
Because it's the only way that you can have a political solution. You cannot...
But Barry,
this is going to be bombed into solution.
If I can, for 5 years, they've been trying at every... Geneva, there's been round after round, and it's been thwarted and blocked by Russia, using its veto every time. Yeah. The only way there can be diplomatic progress, and I want it as much as you, is if there is, unfortunately, I wish the world were different, some kind of credible threat of very precise, very targeted, not reckless action behind it, and we haven't had that.
Nicola Horlick.
Well, I think this is an incredibly complex situation because what is the alternative to the regime that's there already? It's probably not a great prospect, the other alternative. And that's why we've had so little success in the Middle East in the past, because it is such a difficult area of the world. There are so many tribal factions, competing factions, none of which follow our line in terms of democracy and wanting people to be heard and have proper says in everything that happens. And so I think the alternative isn't great. Plus, you've got the situation where you've got Russians on the ground there with bases, and a lot of these assets that you might go and bomb have probably already been moved to those Russian bases. And do you actually want to go and bomb a Russian base? You could have a huge escalation very quickly. And that's why I think Barry's absolutely right, that because it is so complex, it's something that needs to be discussed in Parliament, and it's not a decision that can just be taken by the Cabinet on its own.
Okay. The person on the corner there at the top, in purple, yes.
We're talking a lot about taking military action in Syria. But at the end of the day, what about accountability? Why isn't the UK pushing more for the prosecution of those that are responsible for genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria? We have an international criminal court in The Hague, but the UK should be setting a better example by not only investigating but prosecuting those fighters from all sides in the conflict that are coming back to the UK. Essentially, how is the UK going to go about investigating and prosecuting really grave crimes that we have not seen since the 1990s with the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda?
Joe Johnson, can you answer her?
Well, I completely agree. Of course, once law and order are restored in Syria, it will be time to hold people to account for the heinous crimes which have been committed, crimes against humanity among them. We're not at that stage yet. We're not at the stage yet of peace and reconciliation. We want to get there as fast as we can. But that moment must come, and there should be no doubt at all that those who are responsible for these appalling actions that are taking the lives of innocent children and displacing millions of people from their homes, they will be held to account.
I'll take a couple more points and then we'll move on to another question. You say in the middle there.
We keep hearing about these solutions that are diplomatic, going on into the future. They're all quite lengthy. I think you on the end, you talked about whether it could escalate a conflict, and I think there's no other better way to put it than the conflict's already on our doorstep. In a city that I lived in, Salisbury, a nerve agent was used. That was, from, as far as I see it, from the Russian government. What's happening in Syria is underpinned, as far as I see it, by the Russian government. And what I'm getting frustrated by the most is, especially, as Barry said, there's a place to resolve this in Parliament, but we're not getting anything from the Labour Party or the shadow cabinet which shows us any strength in how we're actually going to deal with an issue that's immediate. And that's what I really want to see.
What do you mean by not showing any strength?
I feel Jeremy Corbyn's being very passive in pushing things down the line and for diplomacy, when actually I think we're beyond that.
OK, Barry Gardiner, a brief answer to that, if you would. Thank you.
Look, I think Jeremy Corbyn has absolutely condemned the Novichok attack, and today what we've seen...
I'd be curious not to condemn it.
Yeah. I dispute that he's not condemned it, but I dispute that he's never been able to point a finger. He's never been happy to accuse.
No, absolutely not. He's done that on many, many occasions since it happened in the first instance. He's condemned the way in which the Russians, and he's done it on two counts. He said that either Russia was guilty by directly taking this action, or it was guilty by allowing the Novichok to have fallen into the wrong hands for somebody else to have done. He respected what the gentleman behind you had said earlier about not actually saying that somebody's guilty until they're proven guilty.
But when he was asked by a student in Derby today if he thought that Putin was responsible for the Salisbury attack, he said someone is responsible for the Salisbury attack. He has not in any way been upfront, in the same way, say, that he has been when Palestinians saw aggression from Israel. He has not taken the same line for Syrians or for people in the UK.
Sorry, he has absolutely condemned Russia for the Novichok attack. But quite honestly, this is, when you're talking about the Syrian situation, to say that it is the leader of the opposition's job to be pushing this in Parliament, this is a situation that all of Parliament must come together and discuss.
You've said but can I just put to you one quote? Hold on a second.
But the gentleman needs to acknowledge...
I know. Can I put to you one quote, though, that what Jeremy Corbyn said on Monday, after this chemical attack, what he called for was an inquiry into this so we can find out exactly who delivered that chemical weapon. What was in his mind? What kind of delivery who did he think might have done it?
Precisely the same thing as the United Nations presumably did when they sent in the inspectorate from the Organisation for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons. And the inspection is now taking place in Duma because it does actually have to establish the facts on the ground. That's what has happened David. So that inspection is now taking place, and he was absolutely right to call for it, because as we've all acknowledged, you need actually to have the evidence if you want to go to the court, if you want the War Crimes Tribunal at the end of the day, which all of us assuredly do, and I think it was a very good point that the lady made earlier about actually holding these people to account. What you need to do is you need to amass the evidence.
All right.
That's what he was talking about, and that is absolutely in line with the United Nations and what they've done.
I think you've answered the point. Let's go up there to the man up there, and we must move on. Yes. You, sir, there. Yeah.
The issue is we're in a new proxy war with Russia, and this is the hottest part of the conflict. There's 6 NATO countries that actually meet their 2% GDP requirement. We need to encourage them to start, the rest to start meeting that requirement.
Okay, and I said I'd bring you in, so I will, and then we will go on to another question.
I'd just like to come back on what Joe Johnson said before, which I think is pretty ridiculous, to be honest, because in my mind, no matter what the decision is, no matter what the approach is, the important thing is that it's voted on in a democratic matter, and the only way to do that is through Parliament. So it doesn't matter if it's required constitutionally, it doesn't matter if you want to or not, you have to, because we need a voice on this, aside from your weak and wobbly government. We need Parliament to vote on this matter.
What's your answer, Joe?
Well, there'll be plenty of opportunities for Parliament to hold the government to account for whatever course of action it chooses.
What does that mean, hold the government to account?
Parliament need to vote on this matter. We need a tangible vote on the approach to Syria. Because look, in the past, whenever the government has gone off on its own way and not let a vote, look what's happened. There's been devastation in that region. We need a vote in Parliament. No question about it.
As I said earlier, no decision on a particular course of action has been taken, nor on the timing of any action.
You're not answering the
question. That might ensue. As I said, there's no constitutional requirement for a vote. There are lots of ways for Parliament to hold governments to account for their actions through debates and other and so on.
Hang on, but he's saying, I don't know what you mean by hold government to account. He's saying the decision should be made by Parliament. Why do you object to that?
Should be voted on by Parliament. It doesn't matter if there's a constitutional requirement or not. There is a moral requirement to have our MPs vote on this. Regardless of what the Constitution says, it needs to happen.
It's only relatively recently that Parliament has taken on this role of authorising military action. It's not part of our system of government. It hasn't traditionally been. Governments do have this prerogative right to take military action in urgent situations, and the Cabinet Manual is pretty clear on that. But I've got to stress that there has been no decision to take military action at this point. What we've said very clearly is we want to uphold...
There's no threat to our country. I completely agree with you. If there was a threat to our country, then it should be the prerogative of the government and the cabinet and so on. But there isn't. This is a far away place, which is very, very complex.
There's a specific extra reason why this should happen in this case, which is you have a government without a majority. Yes, there is a hung parliament. And so... What would normally be in the Cabinet Manual, I can imagine why that's right when you have a normal government. But this is a very abnormal situation. And therefore, I think the questioner here is right, that in this particular situation, and who knows, you know, last time the Commons did come meet to decide this, they voted it down. And at the time, the death toll in Syria was 100,000. And they decided, let's have no action. And here we are 5 years later, and it's 500,000.
And it's proved to have been a great mistake.
Well, that's where I'm driving.
That gave Assad a sense of complete impunity that has encouraged him to continue to use chemical weapons in the 5 years that have elapsed. He's used them on countless occasions since, because we failed to take the action, because Parliament wrongly, in my view, and I didn't vote against the use of airstrikes back in 2013. I voted for it, and I would do so again if any such decision were put to Parliament in my capacity as an MP.
Yes, but if the regime had changed, they may have fallen into the hands of an even worse regime, and that's the problem.
Well, that's a head
OK, let's go on to another question. Just before we do, question time comes from Chesterfield next Thursday, the following week from Bury St Edmunds. Details of how to apply are on the screen there, and I'll give them again at the end. Right, let's go back very much to a domestic question back home. A question from Bradley New, please.
Should there be a shrine for the burglar, Henry Vincent?
Should there be a shrine for the burglar, Henry Vincent? This has attracted a lot of publicity. The burglar, Henry Vincent, who was stabbed by a 78-year-old householder, Richard Osborne Brooks, and the last few days have seen the police at the site and people ripping down flowers that were put there to commemorate the burglar, Henry Vincent. and then more flowers being put up and all the rest of it. Nicola Horlick.
Well, of course, the burglar did a terrible thing, and he was threatening this elderly man with his very sick wife upstairs, and one can totally understand why the victim behaved in the way that he did. But the burglar was also somebody's son, somebody's partner, the father of 2 children, and so you can also understand why the grieving partner has been going there and putting flowers. So it's a very, very sad situation and very difficult, but I imagine that if you're the people living in that road and all of this is going on, you probably don't want that going on in your road. So I can understand why the authorities are trying to prevent the family from going back and putting the flowers there. And it's a very difficult thing from a moral standpoint because somebody has died, has lost their life, and people are mourning that person. But at the end of the day, I think the residents of that street need to be protected from all this, and so stopping the flowers being put there is probably the only way.
Okay. But, yeah. Your question, yeah.
I get your point with that, but where was the grieving partner when he was going around robbing houses? Where was his family when he was going around robbing houses? I believe he was on the most wanted list as well. And this poor guy, he can't go home, he can't go back to his own street because he fears for his life, and the police just stand there while people are erecting this shrine. It's a shrine.
Okay.
It's a shrine.
Okay.
Intimidation.
Point made. Kate Andrews.
I mean, goodness forbid anybody in this audience has actually had that experience, but just try to imagine being in your home with your loved ones. Maybe there is somebody elderly there, maybe there's somebody who's sick, somebody who's vulnerable, and people come and they threaten you, and they don't just threaten to take your things, they threaten you, your physical being. And something terrible happens and you try to defend yourself, and it's something you're going to have to live with for the rest of your life. It's probably going to be extremely hard to know that even in a moment of self-defense you took a life. And then people come to your home, your private property, to mourn the person or the people who put you in that extremely dangerous and fearful situation. I have every sympathy for the family members that have lost somebody that they care about, but my goodness, that is not the appropriate place to grieve. And I think there were a lot of victims in that circumstance, and everybody's life will be changed by it, and it is tragic. But do not go and assault the location in which it happened. Let the people go home and let them rest.
I'm sorry, but I haven't got a lot of sympathy for the burglar. This comes down to choices and consequences. If someone goes out drunk out their head and drives a car and kills himself, it's the same kind of thing. He's gone into somebody's house. I think he had a screwdriver, didn't he? And threatened this poor old fellow who's come down. His wife's upstairs and everything. Horrendous. He's put himself in that position. No sympathy whatsoever. In fact, the householder should be knighted for what he done because he's got a burglar off the street. Because if that didn't happen to him, if that didn't happen to him, then he was ended. Okay. Next week he'd be burgling someone else's house, and it's wrong.
The person up there at the back.
I think the idea that we should be giving knighthoods out for people who have taken someone's life in the saddest of circumstances is absolutely abominable. The whole thing is a terrible thing that's happened, and I agree with Kate on the panel who said that it's not appropriate to go to that place and pay respects.
Okay.
You can go and do that somewhere else, and that would be fair enough.
Joe Johnson.
Well, I think it's obviously tragic for the burglar's family, that goes without saying, and it's sad that he's died in this way, but I think it's equally tragic for the homeowner who's found himself having killed someone and has probably had his own life permanently changed as a result of this experience. The government has taken steps to ensure that homeowners have greater protections when they're acting legitimately in self-defence in this way, as is entirely right. It is an appalling thing to have people break into your home and threaten you with screwdrivers. Completely unacceptable, and we've got to drive that sort of behaviour out.
And the issue of the shrine, which is the question.
But I think a shrine is completely inappropriate. A shrine to the deceased burglar is completely inappropriate in the street. Okay. It's right that his family grieves and that his friends grieve for him, but a shrine near to the place of the home which he was burgling, I think, is completely inappropriate.
Okay. The Chief Superintendent of the Met said, "I don't want anyone to feel intimidated or that they're not being allowed to respond in a dignified way to a tragic death." So the police take a slightly different view. What view do you take, Barry Gardiner?
I disagree with the police officer on that score. I believe that, yes, the family's perfectly entitled to mourn, they're perfectly entitled to set up a shrine, but not on Mr. Osborne Brooks's property. Yeah. I think that is intimidation. I think it is something that Mr. Osborne Brooks and his wife clearly feel threatened by. They've not been able to move back into their home. As I understand it, they're living away from their home because they felt so intimidated by it. He had every right to protect his property. He did that. Tragically, a life has been lost in the process. That life will be mourned by the family, quite properly, but it must be mourned elsewhere.
Okay. Jonathan Friedland.
In a way, it comes down to what you think these flowers are there for and who they're there for. I don't think they're about glorifying the crime or exonerating the crime. I think they're there for the family who are grieving. You know, that's the loss they've had, and therefore they have a right to grieve. I think we agree, really, most of us up here, and several people here generally, that the place for it is the issue, and the place for it is on Vincent's grave, rather than being there in Mr. Osborne Brooks's home. But the right to grieve somebody, even when they've committed a crime, is a right for the family, because it's not for the criminal's sake. He's dead. It's for the family left behind.
Okay. Right, let's go on to a question from Jake Danvers, please.
Do we need to do more to tackle anti-Semitism?
Do we need, a broad question, do we need to do more to tackle anti-Semitism? Maybe with the comments in the Labour Party in mind. Barry Gardiner.
Yes, we absolutely do. Look, I studied Hebrew as one of the subjects I took at university. I attended my first Seder about 35 years ago. I helped to bring the Jews Free School from Camden to my own constituency in Brent North. I'm appalled by the rise of anti-Semitism in our society. Here in Liverpool, your Labour Council took the really progressive step of inviting an old friend of mine, actually, Rabbi Martin Vandenberg, to come and speak to the councillors, to explain to them, to make them aware of what anti-Semitism is like and how it affects the community. The Community Security Trust, I think this year, has identified 22 attacks on Jewish schools. On schools. These are our children, and they're facing those sort of attacks.
And why does the leader of the Labour Party acknowledge that anti-Semitic attitudes have surfaced, I quote him, more often in our ranks in recent years, and the party's been too slow to process it? Why has that all happened?
Look, it should not have happened. I find it shameful, as a member of the Labour Party for whatever it is, 40-odd years, I find it shameful that this is part of what's happening in my party. But, you know, the Labour Party is now over 500,000 strong in this country. It reflects not only the good policies and virtues and things that, the values that Labour has always stood for, but of course there are people that reflect all walks of society, and inevitably we reflect society in its bad points too. What we are absolutely committed to is in eradicating it from the Labour Party, and that's what Jeremy has made absolutely clear. And just last week he wrote to every member of the Labour Party, sent an email out to every member of the Labour Party saying exactly that the Labour Party must be a home for everyone. Look, my party has a history, I think, above any other party, of combating racism, of combating anti-Semitism, of being at the forefront of equalities legislation, whether it's for women's equality or gay equality. We are absolutely proud of our human rights record, and this is something that we will tackle, but it's something that if we simply say, oh, this is a problem for the Labour Party, that's an easy cop-out. It's a problem for society, and the Community Security Trust has made it very clear that there is a rise of anti-Semitism in our society.
All right, Barry,
we have
made
to
the point.
deal with it.
Jonathan Friedland.
Well, Barry is right that it's a wider problem than just the Labour Party, and it is throughout society. And anybody who visits a Jewish school or a synagogue and sees security guards outside understands the reality of that and how difficult that is for this very small community in Britain. But the Labour Party is in focus, as Barry's just acknowledged, and it is for a good reason. He said there that it's bound to reflect society, and just as there are going to be racists in society, there'll be some racists in the Labour Party. The reason why that's not quite good enough is, for one thing, we expect, as you said, Labour to be better than that. It doesn't exist just to reflect society, it exists to change society.
Absolutely.
And so we want it to be better than that. But it also betrays a misunderstanding, as if somehow the racists who have been exposed, the anti-Jewish racists, the anti-Semites, who've been exposed in Labour, somehow wandered into this party by mistake, that they thought it said BNP on the door and they just accidentally found themselves in there. That's not how it worked. The complicated thing here is anti-Semitism, racism, is a general thing, but there is a very specific kind of left anti-Semitism, and people struggle to understand this. And just to take a moment to explain how I see it, most racisms are pretty simple. You just despise and look down on the race that you hate. In the case of anti-Jewish racism, there's this odd dual character, which is, yes, you look down on and despise this group that you think are inferior, but anti-Semites also say that Jews are somehow cunningly above as well as below, that they're powerful and secretly pulling the strings of the world, that they are the secret force of power. And there's this dual attitude to look down on, but also somehow to see them up here.
Can you connect this with the Labour Party, which is where you began?
That is what people on the left are particularly susceptible to, that idea, because they think their job as being a good person on the left is to challenge power. So if you've believed and swallowed this anti-Semitic canard that somehow Jews are the secret power behind the banks, etc., then you're going to subscribe to it. And that is what we've seen in the Labour Party, I'm afraid. If you look on these social media posts, the anti-Semitic expressions are about the old anti-Semitic medieval themes of Rothschilds and bankers and the secret power in the world. They've not been about Israel, like some people have alleged. It's been about that. And that is something that the left and Jeremy Corbyn need to be particularly explicit about. They need to say, we have a specific problem.
But Jonathan, if these are the old tropes from medieval times, then it's not because of the Labour Party, and therefore the association with the Labour Party is not the reason for this being particularly...
But I'm trying to say that the left and Labour are historically, and for the reasons I've tried to explain, particularly susceptible to this message, and it has been particularly prevalent on the further left, the far left, and that's why Jeremy Corbyn, who comes from that tradition, needs to be able to say that of himself, that he too, unfortunately, and obviously he's not an anti-Semite, but he has been looked past anti-Semitism when it occurs from people that he deems ideological comrades of his. And there's case after case after case of that, and he needs to admit it.
Anti-Semitism isn't being tackled as seriously as it should be. I have two children who go to a Jewish school here in Liverpool, and they have been verbally abused just because they have the menorah on their uniform. Awful. They're aged 11 and 7.
Awful. Absolutely.
Joe Johnson.
Well, I do think Jeremy Corbyn is not displaying the leadership that you would expect of the leader of a major political party. He was very, very slow in condemning... He was very, very slow in condemning the anti-Semitic mural. He has let Labour MPs who attended a rally against anti-Semitism in Parliament Square be hounded in their own associations and threatened with deselection. This is completely outrageous failure to show leadership of the Labour Party. I spent this morning in Finchley, in North London, with members of the Orthodox Jewish community, and at times it made me think that we were revisiting some of the darkest decades in European history, because this school, it's a school for Orthodox Jewish boys called Pardes School, had high levels of security on both gates, high gates, to protect the children at this school from anti-Semitism. This is a real and terrifying phenomenon in our society right now, and everybody in public life has a duty to stand up and get rid of this terrible scourge, and I don't feel that the Labour Party is playing its part.
OK, you said that.
I just wanted to ask how much of this is... How relevant is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Because Jonathan gave a talk with Mehdi Hassan in the Huffington Post a while back about this, and I mean, obviously things are different now to how anti-Semitism was in the past, and I just wanted to ask what kind of difficult relationship is there between that.
Nicola Hawley.
One of the reasons I'm proud to be British is because this is a very tolerant country. And I think it's really incumbent upon us, it's not just people in public life, but everybody, to ensure that we have true tolerance and that we accept everybody. It is totally unacceptable for schools to have high security around them, irrespective of whether it's a Jewish school or a Muslim school or any other sort of school, or a Christian school for that matter. So we have to deal with this. In terms of political parties, clearly, if there are people within a political party that are Holocaust deniers, they should be expelled from that party. And action should be taken immediately. There should be no hesitation. And I think the problem is, when you're a leader and you hesitate, that then questions whether you're a good leader. So I think Jeremy Corbyn needs to think long and hard about this and take a more active role and be a better leader in trying to seek out and get rid of anti-Semitism within his party.
Kate Andrews.
In 2016, Jeremy Corbyn ordered an inquiry, which was led by Shami Chakrabarti, into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And that inquiry found that the Labour Party was not overrun with anti-Semitism. She was then later awarded with a lifetime peerage in the House of Lords. What exactly has the Jewish community been rewarded with? You don't have to go back years or months, you just have to go back the past 48 hours to see attacks on the Jewish community, to see a Labour officer in Lambeth tweeting out memes that compare Israel to the Nazis, to see Ken Loach calling for Labour MPs to be removed if they demonstrated against anti-Semitism. This is a deep problem, and it goes even further. The Times YouGov poll on March 30th found that 77% of Labour Party members think that these calls of anti-Semitism are actually to discredit Jeremy Corbyn and to discredit criticisms of Israel. Yes, anti-Semitism can be found across society, but the Labour leadership has done nothing to address the very, very serious problem within its own party. And we need more good people like Barry to step up and be very loud about this, because it should not be tolerated anywhere, but I mean, under no circumstances should it be tolerated at the highest level of politics.
All right. So, Barry Gardiner, you've heard the accusation that hesitation is bad in a leader, that lack of clarity is bad in a leader, not fit to lead the party. What's your plan?
Okay, look, let me try and pick up a number of the points that have been made. First of all, what Joe said, because he said about, and Kate also, about the threats to deselect members of Parliament, Labour members of Parliament, who turned up at the rally outside of Parliament. In fact, I was talking to one of them this morning. She happens to be my PPS. She has 2 Jewish children. She was there protesting against anti-Semitism. And she was criticised by some people. They said, well, didn't you know that rally was going to be used to try and attack Jeremy Corbyn? She spoke to the leader's office. Jeremy has sent a personal letter to her constituency saying that she absolutely had the right to be there because anti-Semitism is a scourge on our society and he will not tolerate it.
So Ken Loach was wrong to say this.
Ken Loach was absolutely wrong, and Jeremy has said as much. Jeremy has said exactly that in the letter that he sent from his office to Anna, to support her for being there to protect her children, just like the lady was saying she wanted to protect hers. In terms of leadership, let me say, and the gentleman also talked about process. The process within any party, and I think it's the same within the Conservative Party, is that discipline is not done by the leader, it's done through the General Secretary of the party. We have just changed the General Secretary of the party, and the new General Secretary of the party, Jenny Formby, actually said that it was her #1 priority to eradicate anti-Semitism from the party and to follow up on all the things within the Chakrabarti report. So I think Jeremy has done the right thing. I think he's supported those members of Parliament who wanted to campaign against anti-Semitism. He has absolutely made it clear that it is unacceptable in our party. And if I can just ask people to step back for a moment, I don't think that there has been a leader of any political party for decades, who has the track record, personal track record, that Jeremy Corbyn does as somebody who has always stood up for human rights, who has always called out racism and who has always been on the side of the underdog.
All right. Do you agree with that, Joe?
Well, no, I think clearly not. I think Labour MPs are facing deselection. They're being hounded by Momentum activists who are demonstrating all of these old anti-Semitic tropes. And it's a travesty, the lack of leadership he's showing.
OK. By my book, we haven't got that much more time, so I think we'll move on to another question. Sorry, who is that shouting out? You can just say it, if you would.
Record.
What?
Like, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, the current Foreign Secretary, has actually been racist on record many times. Genuinely, like, this is terrible.
What? Sorry, what? Yes. What examples? Go on, say it again.
Boris Johnson, the current serving Foreign Secretary, has been racist on record so many times, and we just like glance over it in the media. We just like, oh, it's sound, it's Boris, whatever. Like, it doesn't. No, it's not cool. It's not acceptable to have like a bias from
not
like
a
one
racist
side
bone in his
to the
body.
other.
You want to answer him?
Yeah, not a racist bone in his body.
It's not fair to ask Joe about his brother, but Boris Johnson did refer to people in Africa as pickaninnies with watermelon smiles. That is on the record. He should never have used that language. It was racist language, but I don't think it's fair to go after Joe Johnson about his brother.
OK. Can I just say something? Shouting out doesn't help at all. None of it can be heard, because the microphones aren't on you. You can all hear, and we can all hear, but the audience at home can't hear a word you're saying, so there's no much point. I want to move on to another question, because time is running out on us. And this one is from Patricia Lee, please. Let's have your question.
Is it reasonable to leave a private club and expect to keep all the exact same benefits as members?
Right. The EU, in other words. This one could have been designed for you, I think. The six tests. Yeah. Is it reasonable to leave a private club and expect all the same benefits as the members have? And Labour has 6 tests, which Barry Gardner refers to as bollocks. And if I remember, the guy was sitting where you were, Owen Smith sat in this seat. He was sacked for saying that he wanted a second referendum. You say the Labour Party policy is bollocks, and here you are sitting...
Look, the government said that it will negotiate. The government said it will negotiate a free trade agreement that delivers the exact same benefits as we have as members of the EU. I don't believe they can, and that is what I rather colourfully expressed as beyond credibility. Labour's test is absolutely right. It's to hold the government to account for their promise. We set out...
Well, you mean it's not what you want?
So, let me be clear. We set out our own policy, David, on a new customs union with the EU and a transitional agreement where we stay in the single market and the customs union to give us a seamless transition for businesses to protect jobs and growth in the country. My point's a simple one. If you want all the benefits of a club, you stay in it. I campaign to remain. I would have liked to remain, but we are leaving, and we need to try and make it work. There may be other benefits to leaving, but the Tories should be honest with people. They should stop trying to convince the public that they can leave the club and have the exact same benefits. They can't.
But I'm sorry, I'm still a bit puzzled by this, because Labour did set out 6 tests for a successful Brexit. And you did say, well, let's just take one test, the exact same benefits test. Bollocks. Always has been bollocks and remains it.
Yes, I was talking about the idea that you could have the exact same benefits. Exactly the lady's point. If you leave the club's not going to give you the exact same benefits, and that's why our test is right to say, look, you can't have it.
So you'll vote against any deal the Tories come up with, then?
Look, let them try and come up with one. God knows they've had all this time and they still can't come up with one.
Okay.
You know,
all right.
I mean, they have been so paralysed as a cabinet in trying to get an agreement between themselves that they didn't manage to finish the original negotiations in time about the divorce settlement. We don't know what that's going to be, and goodness knows what they're going to come up with the eventual free trade agreement.
Where's the bollocks, Joe Johnson? That's obviously tonight's question.
Well, I think this is another example of Jeremy Corbyn failing to demonstrate leadership, because Barry Gardiner, who's the shadow international trade secretary, has described the centrepiece of Labour's Brexit policy as bollocks, and yet he retains his position. So this is something of a miracle, in my view. But I think actually it tells you something more important just than that, and that's that Labour is actually just playing games. They're not being straight with the British public about their Brexit policy. They're saying one thing in public and another thing in private recorded meetings. So I think the lack of honesty and a lack of sincerity with the British public. This government, the Conservative government, is trying to make a success of Brexit. Labour is playing political games and basically trying to frustrate it.
Yes.
Do you know, I've watched Question Time, I don't know how many times, on Brexit, and I've come up with one, and it might sound infantile and it might sound simplistic, but why couldn't all these negotiations on fishery policy, on the environment, why couldn't they all have taken place before the Brexit vote? So when you went to the people of this country, you could have said, A, B and C will happen, D, E and F will not happen. And that would have reduced the confusion to zero.
Why on earth do you think that's simplistic?
Why? No, I'm being sarcastic.
Oh.
All right.
Jonathan Friedland.
I think it's a brilliant suggestion, and it's a particularly brilliant argument for there being another vote once there is a deal. Because once there is a deal, then we'll be able to... Essentially, what happened in June 2016 is we were like a family that decides we're going to move house. And then you look around and you look at all these other houses and you think, well, what about this one? We could rent this one. Well, before you decide that, you would have another decision to make. You wouldn't just say, well, look, we voted to move, so we've got to move into this house, whether we like it or not. You would take a new decision. That's why you're right. Once we know the terms of the deal, we should have a say. But I have to say, in terms of what Barry Gardiner was saying, I slightly prefer the early Barry Gardiner, I think, the one we heard before, because I think you were absolutely right, and you were honest, which is you cannot have the exact same benefits from a club when you leave it. And what we should have is the government and everyone who's for leaving should say, we're going to be worse off, but we think that's okay. But they don't say that. They still pretend somehow we can have all the benefits without any of the downsides. It's an irrational thing we are doing, I'm afraid. It is against our national self-interest, and the notion of leaving this particular club, which is, I think you were speaking then about the single market, that was not, can I all remind you, it was not on the ballot paper to leave the single market. It said we were leaving the European Union. It didn't say we were leaving the single market or the customs
Let's hear from some more members of our audience. You up there with spectacles on the side there, yes?
Economically speaking, when it comes to free trade, shouldn't our guiding principle in all of our Brexit negotiations be seeking free trade with the EU and abiding by the natural occurring laws of comparative advantage?
Kate Andrews.
Free trade deals are great. Let's hope that we get one with the EU. I think it looks more and more likely that Britain will. And let Britain try to get them with the rest of the world too, which does require leaving the single market and the Union. You don't get all the benefits, it's true, but there will be new benefits to be reaped by these new opportunities. I mean, obviously, Labour's six-point plan doesn't add up. Points 2 and 3 on the exact same benefits and then sort of a UKIP line on migration contradict each other. But I think the broader point here is that there are going to be a lot of Remainers in particular absolutely dumbfounded in March 2019 when the UK does leave the European Union and it doesn't fall off a cliff. It's not going to be perfect right away, but I think it's going to be okay.
Woman up there. One in the third row from the back there, yes, you. Yep. No, person next to you. Like woman as opposed to man.
I know much has been said about Northern Ireland, and it's become one of the biggest issues of Brexit. But does the panel think that the government can have its cake and eat it in terms of Northern Ireland?
All right. Well, that's slightly not quite the question we're dealing with. But Nicola Horlick, would you like to deal with that as well as the other point?
Well, going back to the original question, no, we can't leave the club and still have all the benefits. And I do worry very deeply about the future of this country outside the EU. I think it's absolutely essential that we remain in the single market. That is not the same as having a free trade deal. There are so many companies, if you listen to the radio, every day there's another company saying that we manufacture not just in the UK, but all around Europe. So you might have a part of a car that's made in Germany, comes here, is put in a vehicle and then exported. Or there might be several parts that move around and come here and then go somewhere else to have another finishing process and then come back to be put in that car before it's exported. And so if you actually get rid of the single market, we're not part of it any longer, you're going to create problems because just an hour's difference, an hour waiting at a port can affect the efficiency of a plant manufacturing cars in this country. And the car industry is a huge success story. You know that. You have cars made here in this area. And at one stage, it was nearly dead. It nearly died, a terrible death, our car industry. But we revived it by inviting foreign companies to come in here and make cars and demonstrated to them that we, the British, could do it really well.
You made that point, but I want to ask you about the question, which was, is it reasonable to leave a private club and expect to get the same benefits?
No, it's not, and we won't.
Okay, and what about Northern Ireland?
Jonathan is completely right about that.
And
Northern Ireland is another thing. We've heard a lot over the last few days about the Good Friday Agreement, and it would be a travesty if we were to have a hard border. No one has told us what's going to happen about the Irish border. It's still an unknown, and we must not allow the bad old days again.
All right.
Liverpool knows more than most, because there are so many people of Irish descent who live here, how terrible the Troubles were. We cannot allow ourselves to go backwards.
OK, we have a minute left. Joe Johnson.
Well, I think one of the most shocking things about Barry Gardner's secret recording was his reference to the Good Friday Agreement, not one reference, but two references to it, as a shibboleth, meaning something that's outmoded, no longer has any relevance or purpose. Frankly, that is an appalling proposition. The Good Friday Agreement remains central to the future of Northern Ireland and its good relations with its various communities. This government stands absolutely behind it, and so does the government of the Republic of Ireland.
OK. Very brief. Shibboleth, what does it mean to you?
Look, sometimes in life it's best just to say sorry.
OK, do you want to say sorry and we'll carry on?
I am deeply sorry that I gave the impression that the Good Friday Agreement is anything other than the essential foundation of the peace that we've enjoyed in Northern Ireland for the past 20 years. It is. I did mean it in its other context, which was as a keyword or a password, and we can have that discussion later.
Right. We can't have it now because we've come to the end of the programme, but thank you for making your point. And thank you. Apologies to those who have your hands up. I'm sorry, we've come to the end of our hour. Next Thursday, we're going to be in Chesterfield. We're going to be joined by Liz Truss, by Diane Abbott, and by Vince Cable. And the week after that, Bury St Edmunds, where Matt Hancock and Caroline Lucas are among those who will be on the panel. You can call 03301239988 if you'd like to come to those two programmes, or go to the website. The address is on the screen there. If you want to have your say on tonight's topics, you may have been listening to this on 5 Live. If not, you can switch to 5 Live. Adrian Childs is there to provide a running commentary on the way that this programme went and to take up issues with his listeners. And it's also on BBC iPlayer, apparently, that. Anyway, my thanks, what a mouthful, to our panel and to all of you who came here to Liverpool to take part. Until next Thursday from Question Time, good night.